million years ago, something happened to the human foot that never happened to any other animal on this planet. And honestly, we're still not entirely sure why it happened at all. A bone in the middle of the foot lifted itself into an arch. A tendon running up the back of the ankle turned into something closer to a coiled spring than a piece of rope. And somewhere in that slow, accidental, million-year-long process, your body got built. Not for lifting weights, not for sprinting 40 yards, not for any of the things we now put under the umbrella of exercise. It got built for one motion, repeated for hours at a time, day after day, walking. And here's what's strange. Almost nobody talks about it this way. We talk about walking like it's the exercise you settle for when you can't do the real one. The warm-up, the thing your doctor tells you to do when running is off the table. But if you look at what your body actually is, structurally, mechanically, from the ground up, that framing gets it backwards. Walking isn't the fallback. It's the original design. By the time we're finished here, you're going to know exactly what your joints do differently the second you go for a walk instead of a run. You're going to know what your brain does within minutes of stepping outside that it doesn't do sitting at a desk. And you're going to know why a team of researchers, after tracking over 200,000 people, found that something as ordinary as adding 1,000 extra steps to your day was tied to a 15% drop in the risk of dying in the years that followed. That's not a guess. That's not a wellness slogan somebody printed on a water bottle. That's a number sitting in a peer-reviewed journal waiting for someone to actually pay attention to it. So let's start with the foot, because the foot is where this whole story begins, and it's a stranger story than you'd expect. If you've ever looked closely at a chimpanzee's foot, it looks almost like a hand. Long, flexible toes built for grabbing branches, flat across the bottom, great for climbing, not so great for covering ground. Our feet went in a completely different direction. 26 bones, 33 joints, over 100 muscles, tendons, and ligaments, all arranged around that raised arch you probably never think about unless it starts to hurt. For a long time, the assumption was that this arch worked like a simple spring. Store energy on one step, release it on the next like a pogo stick. But a study out of the University of Wisconsin, using high-speed X-ray to actually watch the bones move inside a walking foot in real time, found something a little more elegant than that. The arch doesn't just store energy and dump it back out. It recoils in a way that helps the ankle lift the entire body forward, stretching out the time your foot stays in contact with the ground and setting up the push for the next stride. It's not just a spring, it's closer to a lever that's also a spring, doing two jobs at once in the same half second your heel touches the pavement. And then there's the Achilles tendon sitting there quietly at the back of your ankle, which might be the single most underrated structure in the entire human body. Fossil evidence tells us something remarkable. Australopithecus, one of our early ancestors, didn't have a well-developed version of this tendon. It shows up later with Homo habilis and Homo erectus. And when it does show up, it changes everything, because an elastic tendon like that stores mechanical energy the same way a bent bow stores energy in its string, and researchers estimate it cuts the metabolic cost of covering long distances by roughly half. Your ancestors weren't just walking because they had no other choice. Their bodies were quietly being re-engineered, generation after generation, to make walking cost almost nothing. There's a reason for that, and it's not a comfortable one. Humans are slow compared to almost every other mammal over a short sprint. A deer will leave us in the dust over 100 yards without even trying. But stretch that race out to 15 or 20 miles across open, hot terrain, and something strange happens. We start to win. There are hunting communities today, in parts of the Kalahari Desert, who still use exactly this strategy. They don't outrun the animal. They simply keep moving at a pace the animal can't sustain in the heat, hour after hour, until it finally collapses from exhaustion. That's not folklore. It's documented, filmed, studied. And it only works because of that arch, that tendon, and a sweating system that lets the human body cool itself while still moving, which almost nothing else in the animal kingdom can manage nearly as well. Most mammals pant to cool down, which means they have to stop moving to breathe properly. We sweat through millions of glands spread across bare skin, which means we can keep going while every other large animal on the savanna is forced to slow down or stop. So when the title of this says your body was designed for walking, that's not a metaphor. That's an engineering history, written directly into your skeleton, your tendons, and even your skin. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the story doesn't stop at the ankle. It goes all the way up to your heart, and the numbers here are honestly hard to argue with. In 2023, a team pulled together 17 separate studies covering close to 227,000 people and asked a simple question: does the number of steps you take each day actually predict how long you live? The answer wasn't subtle. Every additional 1,000 steps a day was tied to a 15% reduction in all-cause mortality. Every additional 500 steps was tied to a 7% drop in cardiovascular death specifically. A separate large analysis that same year found meaningful benefits starting somewhere around 2,600 to 2,800 steps a day, with the risk of dying continuing to drop all the way up to around 8,800 steps. And a study following middle-aged adults for almost 11 years found that people hitting 7,000 steps a day or more had somewhere between 50 and 70% lower risk of dying during the study period compared to people staying under that number. Sit with that for a second. 50 to 70%. That's not the kind of number you usually see attached to something you can do in your driveway, in your pajamas, without spending a single dollar. And walking isn't just talking to your heart. It's talking to your brain in a way that's honestly a little bit magical once you understand the mechanism behind it. There's a study out of Stanford where researchers had people sit and think of creative uses for ordinary objects, then had those same people do the identical task while walking, sometimes on a treadmill, indoors, sometimes outside in the open air. Walking increased creative output by an average of 60%. 60. And 81% of the people in the study performed better while walking than while sitting still. What's strange is that the boost didn't vanish the moment they sat back down. It lingered. Your brain doesn't just get more creative while your legs happen to be moving. It seems to stay a little more open for a while afterward, as if the walking primed something that took a few minutes to fade. And it's not only creativity. There's a year-long study on older adults where one group did regular aerobic walking and another group did stretching and toning instead. After 12 months, the walking group's hippocampus, the part of the brain most responsible for memory, and the part that shrinks first in age-related decline, had actually grown by about 2%. 2% might sound small until you realize the stretching group's hippocampus shrank by almost 1.5% over that exact same year. That's not just slowing down decline, that's a physical structure inside your skull getting measurably bigger because you kept walking regularly. Nobody puts that on the little screen at the front of a treadmill. There's one more piece of the brain story worth sitting with before we move on, and it has nothing to do with memory or creativity. It has to do with mood. Researchers pooled together 33 separate studies covering almost 96,000 adults and found that people walking 7,000 or more steps a day had roughly a 30% lower risk of depression compared with people walking fewer than 7,000. And the benefit didn't require some heroic daily distance. Even 5,000 steps a day was tied to noticeably fewer depressive symptoms compared with people under that number. Nobody's claiming a walk replaces real treatment when someone actually needs it, but it's remarkable that something this simple shows up again and again in numbers that size. Now let's talk about something more immediate, your blood sugar, right after you eat. There's research showing that just 2 to 5 minutes of light walking after a meal can lower your blood sugar response by around 17% compared to simply sitting there. Stretch that walk out to 10 or 15 minutes, and the reduction in your glucose spike can climb into the 20 to 30% range. The mechanism is almost funny in how simple it is. When your muscles contract during walking, they pull glucose out of your bloodstream through a pathway that doesn't even require insulin to work. Your leg muscles are, quite literally, competing with your bloodstream for sugar, and they usually win that fight. This is one of those pieces of information that should be printed on every restaurant menu in the country, and instead it's sitting quietly in a medical journal that almost nobody outside the field ever opens. And here's the part that ties all of this together: why walking specifically, and not running, is the one exercise your body can keep doing for the rest of your life without slowly wearing itself down in the process. When your foot hits the ground while walking, the force traveling up through your knee is somewhere around 1 to 1.5 times your body weight. Running is a different game entirely. The impact climbs to somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5 times your body weight, sometimes higher, because running involves an actual flight phase, a moment where both feet leave the ground at once, and then you land on a single leg, absorbing everything at once. That's not a knock on running. Plenty of people run for decades without any real trouble. But it does mean walking is the one movement your joints can absorb, day after day, decade after decade, without needing recovery days, without needing a new pair of shoes every few hundred miles, without needing anything at all except somewhere to put one foot in front of the other. This matters more the older you get, not less. Cartilage doesn't regenerate the way it did at 20. The cushioning between your bones gets a little thinner with every passing decade, which means the load traveling through your knees and hips on impact matters more than it used to, not less. A movement generating 1 to 1.5 times body weight in force is something a 60-year-old joint can absorb comfortably for a 30-minute walk almost every day of the week. A movement generating 3 times that force is a very different conversation. This is exactly why walking keeps showing up decade after decade as the one form of movement doctors recommend almost universally. And here's the part that tends to surprise people most. National health guidelines generally call for about 150 minutes of moderate activity a week to meet the baseline for good cardiovascular health. That's it. Spread across 7 days, that's a little over 20 minutes a day, roughly the time it takes to walk to a coffee shop and back, or finish a couple of loops around the block while you're on a phone call you were going to take anyway. You're not looking at some grueling hour-and-a-half gym session 5 days a week. You're looking at 20 minutes, at a pace where you can still hold a conversation, and the studies we just went through are already measuring people living inside that range. Which brings us right back to that arch, 2 million years in the making, and that spring-loaded tendon at the back of your ankle that's been quietly waiting this whole time for you to actually use it the way it was built to be used. You don't need a gym membership for any of this. You don't need to carve an hour out of a day that doesn't have one to spare, or buy equipment, or wait until Monday to start. The body carrying you through this exact moment was shaped bone by bone, tendon by tendon, across a couple of million years, for one specific thing, putting one foot in front of the other for a while, on a fairly regular basis. Everything we just walked through, the treadmill studies, the fitness trackers, the peer-reviewed numbers, that's just modern language for something your ancestors already understood without needing a single published paper to prove it to them. So maybe the honest ending here isn't some big dramatic call to action. It's smaller than that, and probably more useful. The next time you finish a meal, or you're stuck on a problem you can't quite think your way through, or your body is just quietly asking for something you can't name, you already know now exactly what it's asking for. It's not asking for more. It's asking for the one thing it was built for 2 million years ago, and it's still sitting right there in your legs waiting for you to use it. There's something almost funny about how long it took to arrive at this conclusion through peer-reviewed studies, brain scans, and force plate laboratories, when the answer was always just sitting there in the architecture of a single bone in your foot. Nobody had to invent walking. Nobody had to discover it in a lab. It was built into you before you were born, tested across a couple million years of trial and error, refined by every ancestor who survived long enough to pass it on. All the science we just went through isn't teaching your body something new. It's just catching up slowly to something your skeleton already knew. If this is the kind of thing that pulls you in, pulling apart why the body does what it does instead of just being told to trust it, that's the whole reason this channel exists. Stick around and subscribe, and next time we'll go looking for the next answer that's been sitting in plain sight the whole time.